It started as just another visual impairment awareness segment on The Tonight Show, until a Braille transcriptionist revealed that after 25 years of making the written world accessible through touch, she could no longer feel the difference between knowledge and emptiness beneath her fingertips. The Tonight Show studio was filled with the thoughtful, inclusive energy that came from Jimmy Fallon's commitment to highlighting accessibility and the often invisible work that made education and information available to people with disabilities. Tonight's focus was on visual impairment services and the specialized professionals who ensured that blindness didn't become a barrier to learning. And Jimmy had assembled a panel of advocates, educators, and accessibility experts who worked to create equal access to information. The segment was designed to educate viewers about visual impairment while honoring the people who dedicated their careers to translating the visual world into formats that could be experienced through other senses. Jimmy understood that behind every accessible textbook, every Braille menu, and every tactile document was a skilled professional who had mastered the intricate art of making written information tangible. Among the guests was Patricia Williams, a 52-year-old woman who had been working as a professional Braille transcriptionist for over 2 decades. Patricia was a soft-spoken woman with gentle brown eyes behind reading glasses, wearing a simple cardigan over a blouse, and there was something about the way she held her hands with particular care and awareness that immediately suggested someone whose fingers were essential tools of her trade. Her hands showed the subtle calluses and heightened sensitivity that came from decades of reading and creating Braille texts. Fingers that had learned to distinguish between the most minute variations in raised dots. Patricia represented the hundreds of Braille transcriptionists across America who served as bridges between the visual and tactile worlds, making literature, textbooks, and essential documents accessible to people who experience the world through touch. Jimmy had invited Patricia to share insights about Braille transcription, perhaps discuss the intricate process of converting printed text into Braille, or talk about the technology that helped make books and documents accessible to blind readers. It was supposed to be an educational conversation about a highly specialized profession that was crucial to educational accessibility. But as Jimmy began the interview, something in Patricia's demeanor immediately suggested that this would be more than a technical discussion of Braille production. "Patricia," Jimmy said with his characteristic warmth, 25 years as a Braille transcriptionist. That's an extraordinary career dedicated to making information accessible to people who are blind or visually impaired. Tell us what drew you to this specialized work." Patricia smiled, but there was a profound sadness in her expression that seemed incongruous with someone discussing work that brought knowledge to others. "Well, Mr. Fallon, I became a Braille transcriptionist because I believe that everyone deserves access to information, regardless of how they experience the world. When someone loses their sight, they shouldn't also lose their ability to read, learn, and access the same books and documents that sighted people take for granted." The audience was quiet, immediately understanding the importance of Patricia's mission. "That sounds incredibly meaningful," Jimmy said. "What's it like to translate printed text into Braille? What does that process involve?" Patricia's expression became more serious as she considered how to explain the complexity of her work. "Mr. Fallon, Braille transcription is much more than just converting letters into dots. Every page of text requires understanding context, formatting, mathematical equations, scientific diagrams, even the emotional tone that needs to be preserved when someone reads with their fingers instead of their eyes." Jimmy leaned forward, clearly impressed by the skill and sensitivity required for Patricia's work. For 25 years, Patricia continued, I've transcribed thousands of books, textbooks, legal documents, medical information, children's stories, poetry collections, and educational materials. Every dot I create with my stylus or Braille embosser becomes part of someone's education, someone's professional development, someone's personal enjoyment. The studio was growing quieter as the audience began to understand the enormous responsibility and skill that Patricia brought to her work. Patricia, Jimmy said, in 25 years, how many documents have you transcribed into Braille? Patricia paused, calculating numbers that clearly carried deep meaning for her. Over 8,000 documents, Mr. Fallon. Textbooks for blind students, novels for people who read for pleasure, technical manuals for professionals who lost their sight, children's books for families who want to read together regardless of visual ability. Jimmy was clearly moved by the scope of knowledge that Patricia had made accessible throughout her career. 8,000 documents. You've literally opened up entire worlds of information for thousands of people. That's incredible service. Patricia nodded, but instead of satisfaction, her expression showed something that looked like grief and frustration. It has been meaningful service, Mr. Fallon. But that service is ending in a way I never expected. Jimmy's expression shifted to concern as he sensed that Patricia was leading toward something difficult. What do you mean? Jimmy asked gently. Patricia looked down at her hands, which Jimmy now noticed she was holding with particular care, as if they were somehow different than they used to be. When she looked back up, there were tears in her eyes. Mr. Fallon, Patricia said, I can't feel the Braille dots anymore. The studio fell completely silent. Jimmy's face showed growing alarm as he processed what Patricia had just revealed. What's wrong? Jimmy asked softly. Patricia held up her hands, and Jimmy could see that she was touching her fingertips together in a testing motion, as if trying to assess their sensitivity. Diabetic neuropathy, she said quietly. Nerve damage in my fingertips caused by complications from diabetes that I've been managing for 15 years. The audience was stunned into silence, many of them beginning to understand that they were witnessing the end of a career built entirely on tactile sensitivity. It started about a year ago with occasional numbness, Patricia continued, her voice beginning to break. I thought it was just fatigue from long transcription sessions, but the numbness got progressively worse. My ability to distinguish between different Braille characters began to decline. Jimmy was openly emotional now, understanding that Patricia was describing the loss of the very sense that her profession depended on. Braille reading and transcription requires absolute tactile precision, Patricia explained, tears now flowing freely. The difference between the letter A and the letter E in Braille is just one dot. The difference between a period and a comma is the placement of a single raised point. If I can't feel those distinctions, I can't transcribe accurately. The studio was so quiet that the air conditioning seemed loud. Jimmy's face showed the devastating impact of Patricia's confession. 6 months ago, Patricia continued, I was working on a chemistry textbook for a blind college student. The formulas were incredibly complex, requiring precise placement of mathematical symbols in Braille notation. Halfway through the transcription, I realized I couldn't distinguish between similar Braille characters. Jimmy could see that Patricia was tormented by the idea that her disability might compromise the accuracy that blind readers depended on. 3 months ago, Patricia said, now speaking with obvious difficulty as emotion overwhelmed her, I was transcribing a children's book for a 5-year-old who was learning to read Braille. I made several errors because I couldn't feel the difference between letters that look similar in Braille. When the child's mother pointed out the mistakes, I knew I couldn't continue. Jimmy stood up and walked closer to Patricia, understanding that she was mourning not just the end of her career, but the loss of her ability to serve the blind community that had depended on her skill. "Patricia," Jimmy said, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder, "you've spent 25 years using your fingertips to give people access to knowledge and literature. The fact that diabetes has affected your tactile sensitivity doesn't diminish what you've accomplished." Patricia looked at Jimmy with tears streaming down her face. "Mr. Fallon, there are blind students right now who need textbooks transcribed, authors who want their books available in Braille, families who want to share reading experiences together. Every document I can't transcribe is knowledge that remains inaccessible to people who deserve to read it." Jimmy could see that Patricia was devastated by the idea that her inability to continue working might deny access to information for people who were already facing barriers. "When you say you can't feel the Braille dots anymore," Jimmy asked, "what does that mean for your future as a transcriptionist?" Patricia looked around the studio, then back at Jimmy. "Next month, I'm officially retiring from Braille transcription. After 25 years of making the written world accessible through touch, I have to step away because I can no longer trust my fingertips to accurately translate information that people depend on." Jimmy looked directly into the camera. "Ladies and gentlemen, what Patricia is describing represents something we rarely discuss about accessibility professions. The irony that someone who has spent their career serving people with disabilities can develop a disability that affects their ability to continue that service." He turned back to Patricia. "But Patricia, before you step away from Braille transcription, I want to show you something. I want you to understand what 25 years of making information accessible has meant to the people whose education and independence you've supported." Patricia looked confused. "What do you mean?" Jimmy walked to his desk and picked up his phone. "Patricia, you mentioned that you've transcribed over 8,000 documents. What if we could show you the impact of that accessibility work? What if we could connect you with some of the people whose lives have been enriched by the Braille materials you've created?" Jimmy looked into the camera. "We're putting out a call right now. If Patricia Williams transcribed Braille materials that helped your education, your career, or your personal reading, we want to hear from you. Use the hashtag #ThankYouPatricia and share how her work made information accessible to you." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within minutes, social media was flooded with testimonials from blind and visually impaired people whose education, careers, and personal lives had been enhanced by Braille materials that Patricia had transcribed over her quarter-century career. But Jimmy had arranged something even more powerful. Over the following week, his production team worked to track down some of the people whose access to information had been directly enabled by Patricia's transcription work, people who wanted to thank her personally for making knowledge tangible. The next week, Jimmy invited Patricia back to the show for what she thought would be a follow-up conversation about supporting transcriptionists with disabilities. Instead, he had arranged something unprecedented. "Patricia," Jimmy said as she sat carefully on stage, "you told me that you're heartbroken about the documents you can no longer transcribe. Tonight, I want you to meet some of the people whose lives have been transformed by the thousands of documents you have transcribed. One by one, people whose education and independence had been enabled by Patricia's Braille transcriptions were brought on stage via video call to thank her personally. First was Michael Rodriguez, whose medical school textbooks Patricia had transcribed 8 years earlier. "Patricia," Michael said through tears, "you probably don't remember, but you transcribed my anatomy and physiology textbooks when I was a first-year medical student. I had lost my sight in a car accident, and I thought my dream of becoming a doctor was over." Patricia stared at the screen with growing recognition. "Dr. Rodriguez, the medical text with all the complex anatomical diagrams and Latin terminology." "That's right," Michael replied. Patricia, your transcription work didn't just give me access to my textbooks. It gave me back my future. Because of your precise translation of complex medical information into Braille, I was able to complete medical school. I'm now a practicing physician, and every patient I treat benefits from the education you made accessible to me. Next was Sarah Johnson, whose childhood reading had been enabled by Patricia's transcription of children's books 12 years earlier. Patricia, Sarah said, you transcribed the entire Harry Potter series into Braille for me when I was 10 years old. I had been struggling to find books that I could read independently, and you made magic literally tangible for me. Patricia was crying as she remembered the months of work required to transcribe the complex fantasy novels. Those books had so many invented words and magical terminology that required special formatting. Because of your work, Sarah continued, I fell in love with reading. I went on to study English literature in college, and I'm now a teacher working with visually impaired students. Your transcription didn't just give me books. It gave me a career helping other blind children discover the joy of reading. The testimonials continued for over an hour. A law student whose legal textbooks Patricia had transcribed, enabling him to become a civil rights attorney. A grandmother whose cookbook transcriptions had allowed her to continue cooking for her family after losing her sight. A poet whose work Patricia had transcribed, making her own writing accessible to her after vision loss. Each story revealed not just Patricia's technical skill in Braille transcription, but the ripple effects of accessible information, careers enabled, independence maintained, families brought together through shared reading experiences. Perhaps the most powerful testimony came from Jennifer Martinez, a blind mother whose parenting books Patricia had transcribed 5 years earlier. Patricia, Jennifer said, I know you're struggling with not being able to transcribe anymore, but I want you to know something. When I became a mother, I was terrified because I couldn't read traditional parenting books. You transcribed dozens of child development and parenting guides for me. Patricia was overwhelmed, crying as she remembered the urgent requests from new parents who needed accessible information. Patricia, Jennifer continued, your work didn't just help me become a better mother. It helped me feel confident that being blind didn't disqualify me from raising children. Every milestone my children reach is partly possible because you gave me access to the information I needed to support their development. As the testimonials concluded, Jimmy turned to Patricia, who was surrounded virtually by dozens of people whose lives had been enriched by her dedication to accessibility. Patricia, Jimmy said, you told me that you were heartbroken about the documents you can no longer transcribe. But what we've heard tonight is that you've created a legacy of accessibility that has transformed education, careers, and families in ways that will continue long after you step away from Braille transcription. Jimmy looked directly into the camera. And to everyone watching, Patricia's story reminds us that accessibility work is often done by individuals whose own disabilities can affect their ability to continue serving others with disabilities. He turned back to Patricia, which is why we're announcing the Patricia Williams Accessibility Workers Support Fund, which will provide medical care, assistive technology, and career transition support for accessibility professionals dealing with their own disabilities. 6 months later, Patricia had transitioned into a consulting role where she trained new Braille transcriptionists and developed quality control standards for Braille production. The support fund had provided assistance for dozens of accessibility workers with various disabilities. Because sometimes the people who make information accessible need to be reminded that they have made knowledge tangible in ways that continue to educate and inspire long after their own ability to touch the dots has faded, and that 25 years of opening books with fingertips creates literacy that opens minds for generations to come.